Hello YouTube! Today I'm going to be tackling the topic of CNS fatigue, something that I'm certain you've heard about because it's a recurrent subject in fitness related videos. But it was not always the case. Actually, it's something that came on the scene a few years back, I would say, and it's actually a good thing because it used to be a time where we completely ignored that facet of recovery. Because when you talk about recovery, there are two big aspects to keep in mind. You have your muscles and you have your nervous system. After that, of course, those two categories have subcategories. You have several different types of nervous systems and of iterations of the nervous system. But what most people talk about when they actually tackle this subject is the central nervous system, which is in reality just a general term that covers a lot of other things that serve to, in a sense, separate the muscle with the system on which the muscles are grafted. And you will see that this is extremely important because if you only take into account one or the other to discuss lifting and programming and muscle gains, you quickly run into a problem. And it's interesting because, again, look at the semantics. Muscle gains. Why would we need to keep into account the central nervous system if the only thing we wish to grow is the muscles? Well, the answer is you grow the muscles through movement. Movement is triggered by function, and what triggers function? The nerves. It's the nerves that activate the muscles, and then you have the entire tendons and all of the skeletal system that also plays a role, but you cannot separate them. You cannot just stimulate your muscles in a vacuum. They have to be stimulated through something, and that something is in portions. So every single time you train the muscles, the nervous system has to work as well, and therefore fatigue is accumulated. And that's what we're going to discuss today, because there are a lot of discussions around the very topic of central nervous system fatigue and the impact it has and the importance of it as well. Some people would tell you that it's not that important. Some people would tell you that it's the most important thing. And I think that I strike a nice middle ground, and I'm going to explain to you how to actually think about the topic, how to, in a sense, approach the issue so as to make sure that you make as much muscle gains as possible. So, the reason why people care about it so much, of course, is because there is a price attached with every movement, and the logic is that if you overtax the CNS, you're going to have to pay a price, just like if you overtax the muscles. And that is absolutely sound logic, a logic that bodybuilding for many years completely ignored, meaning that if you go back 10 years, good luck finding any related discussions about the CNS on a bodybuilding channel. You would have already been lucky to hear a sound and reasonable discussion about recovery. Most of the time, the only thing bodybuilders care about is muscle, 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 and the nerves were never taken into account because, as I said, the only thing that mattered was muscle gains, and of course, logic dictates that if you want more muscles, the only thing you have to actually care about is muscles. That is a very simplistic mindset, and the reason why many people didn't make any gains following that type of channels. Now, the problem with not taking the CNS into account, as I said, is that it ignores the way the body functions. And it also presents the CNS as a byproduct, something that is mostly useless and not to be taken into account. And I disagree with that. However, I think there is a distinction to be made. The CNS is something we all possess, but the way we trigger it and we want to actually treat it for performance is going to differ for two types of people. The people who live for performance and the people who live for aesthetics. The two are not the same. And this is where we meet our first divergence. If you talk to a powerlifter or a bodybuilder, you're going to get different answers. It's what I already presented. And yes, it's true that bodybuilders of the past, at least on YouTube, were too ignorant of the CNS. But this ignorance, as I said, was for a reason. It's because CNS fatigue management is not as important for people who are aesthetic oriented as opposed to strength athletes. And I'm going to explain to you why right now. So the CNS, as I said, triggers the muscles into function. And the intensity with which the muscle is going to be able to produce power relates directly to the ability of the CNS to fire. This is the reason why many people will tell you that most strength sports have, yes, a muscle component, but also a large skill component to it. And what is skill? A skill is the ability to recruit as many neurons as possible for a dictated pattern of movement so as to be able to execute it with as much power as possible, aka recruit as much muscle fiber as possible. And you do that through the CNS. So this dictates also that if you are not able to have a fully recovered CNS, you won't be able to recruit as much muscle fibers as you could, and your power output is going to be greatly damaged. For any strength athlete, that is of course a death sentence, and therefore they're going to try to avoid that as much as possible because their goal is performance. But if you look at the same problem from the lens of a bodybuilder, now the issue remains the same, and your CNS will prevent you from actually performing at your peak if you actually neglected its recovery. But it doesn't truly matter because the goal of a bodybuilder is not to hit 1 rep maxes. So that is the first, in a sense, nuance I want to offer on the discussion, because too many people approach it from a standpoint of just generalism, or they think that everyone has the same goals. That's not the case. YouTube is powerlifting centric, so of course, most people who talk about the CNS talk about it from the standpoint of a powerlifter. I want to offer the standpoint of a bodybuilder that understands the importance of the CNS, but wants to also, in a sense, offer a situation or perspective in which CNS fatigue is not seen as the devil, and therefore its management is not a priority. I also want to point out the fact that in the same realm of logic, you will notice that strength athletes tend to tax their CNS much more than bodybuilders because they do movements that are very intensive on the nerves, and therefore they fatigue them more. For example, 1 rep maxes. It cracks me up because there's a lot of discussions about fatigue to stimulus ratio. And the thing that I never see pointed out is that for hypertrophy, 1 rep maxes have an atrocious fatigue to stimulus ratio, meaning that the amount of burden they put on the nervous system and on the muscles and tendons and joints compared to the muscle fiber damage is just ridiculously bad. It's so skewed towards just improper practices that it's the reason why I say that people who bodybuild should never do 1 rep maxes, at least not 100%, because it's entirely useless for hypertrophy. For strength, it's absolutely vital, and this is the great divide between size and strength. It's the reason why people who powerlift are going to have to pay closer attention to their CNS recovery, because they do 1 rep maxes, they test their strength, and that takes a ton of recovery, right? It puts a toll on the body. It's also the fact that they do a ton of the big three. They tend to repeat compound movements with a lot of load, which has a tendency to also accumulate fatigue, which then leads to practices like the deloads. Now, I'm not going to go into the topic of deloads again today because 2 individuals have made good videos that contain a lot of good points that I want to use to make a big response, so as to offer again a more nuanced and detailed view of my practice of bodybuilding deloads as compared to powerlifting deloads. But deloads are perfectly justified, at least in the form that most powerlifters engage in, when it comes to the topic I just discussed. If you're going to tax the CNS to such a level that it needs to recover for days and days at a time, then a deload is justified. But a bodybuilder will never actually tire the CNS that much, and this is why the deloads with a powerlifting template are useless. It's because you're recovering from something that you didn't really tax in the first place, and if you did tax it, it means that you most likely engaged in 1 rep maxes and in practices that are not proper for hypertrophy and bodybuilding in the first place. So you lost the plot. But again, it's a discussion for next week. Now, doesn't mean that bodybuilders need to ignore the CNS. I already said that. Bodybuilders need to account for CNS recovery, because at the end of the day, the muscles share the same body. And it's a point I hear brought out a ton by people who misunderstand its application. Yes, you are correct. Looking at recovery from the standpoint of each muscle as an independent entity is misguided, because at the end of the day, again, your muscles are not floating in space, and they are not just, again, existing in vacuums with their own little recovery pool. They all are dipping in a bigger pool, and that bigger pool is the body. So in a sense, to reuse my metaphor of the buckets, it's as if you had a giant bucket, and in the bucket are floating other smaller buckets. The big bucket is the body, the smaller buckets are the muscles. Every single time you train one of the small buckets, some of the water in the big bucket is going to pour out as well. From that metaphor, we can already also understand one thing. The CNS has a greater power of expenditure and recovery than you might think. But, and I don't want to go too deep into that because I can already feel myself sleeping for my love of metaphor and analogies, but you also have to understand that if the bucket of the CNS is that massive, yes, it can expend more energy, but it doesn't mean that it fills up as fast as the other buckets. If anything, it fills up slower because there is more volume of water in it. And even though it would be greatly beneficial for the human species if the CNS would match its actual volume capacity in terms of recovery, meaning that it should logically recover faster, it doesn't. It has a tendency to recover at the same rate as the muscles, and therefore many people find out that yes, if you truly take a lot of water out of the CNS recovery pool, yes, you're going to have to rest a long time to actually let it stay afloat again. It's the reason why I recommend people to not actually go that deep and to leave a lot of water in that tank. We're going to stay here for that metaphor. I hope it makes you understand the way I personally think about the recovery buckets in a more straightforward fashion. Now, because, as I said, the muscles share the same body, it is true that every time you train a muscle and you're going to engage in recovery for that muscle and you empty the bucket for that muscle, some of the CNS gets tired as well. That is absolutely correct. However, this doesn't mean that deloads are justified. It just means that when you are pouring the water out of the bucket for the muscles, you have to also keep an eye on the bigger bucket, that is the CNS. And you also have to keep in mind that just because, or rather, just like the CNS, not all of the buckets in the big bucket are the same size, and they don't all recover at the same rate and pace. And also, every time you pour water out of one of the buckets doesn't mean that the CNS bucket is being emptied at the same rate. It's something I'm going to cover again. You'll see that it's very simple. But that is the admission of bodybuilding. Yes, the CNS matters, but not as much. And I'm going to explain to you why. It's important to say, because I don't want people of accusing me to ignoring CNS fatigue. No, CNS fatigue is of course real, and it can come from many aspects, by the way. I think that too many people underestimate the other aspects of life that can actually tire the CNS. Like, for example, poor sleep, any level of stress, and adrenal fatigue as well. It's something that I also never seen point out. Just like with 1 rep maxes, drinking coffee and caffeine tires your nervous system because you constantly have it through impulses through the body to keep you dynamic and awake. That has also an impact. That is a price to pay. It might very well be that the type of people who need constant deloads and who cannot train for very long without actually needing those deloads might just also be overusing and overtaxing their CNS via other means. If not all of the aspects and facets of recovery are taken into account, you might actually have holes in that bucket and it might be emptied by other aspects of your life. So keep that in mind. It's not discussed enough. Yes, lifting tires the CNS, but it's not the only thing. It's the same with tendons. And all of these are ignored, and it's also the reason why the CNS fatigue topic tends to be widely overblown. And this is where I get into the territory as to why it's not as important for bodybuilders, because many people who listen to those who preach CNS fatigue and who say you have to be very careful are bodybuilders themselves. They train for aesthetics and they sabotage their programs, they sabotage their progression because they engage in overly cautious practices that make sense for certain people but not others. Example, imagine someone lives in a country with coconut trees and when they go on a beach near the trees, they have a helmet. Why? Because there's coconuts falling and they can kill them. So they have to be more cautious. Now you live in the desert with no coconut trees, but you still wear the helmet. Why? Because you talk to one guy that has to wear it and he convinced you to wear one, but there are no coconut trees where you live. That is the exact same thing. Most of the people who are going to be cautious because of CNS fatigue do so without realizing that they don't even tax their CNS in the first place. And the reason why is because you will find out that, as I said, your CNS has much more of a capacity than you first think. And the proof of the matter is that we as humans, and it stopped 200 years ago around that ballpark, but we as humans have always worked. We've always used our body. And it didn't used to be just 2 or 3 hours a day. It used to be 8, 10, 12 hours a day where people would work non-stop. They would be physical non-stop. None of them deloaded. None of them had to actually take a break. People just kept on going. And the reason why is, one, they actually had bigger tanks than us because they trained it. Because yes, The size of the buckets is flexible. The bucket of the recovery can actually be aggrandized, it can grow. All of that is a discussion related to work capacity, but there's no fixed size. And also the size of my CNS bucket is not the size of your CNS bucket. Mine might be more endurant. Yours might be able to fill up faster, etc., etc. Yours might actually need more water to be emptied to have the same impulse in terms of expenditure of the nervous system. All of these are fascinating topics that relate to genetics and the difference between individuals. It's not the topic at hand. But I want you to understand that because most people, you will find, preemptively detrain to prevent CNS fatigue from happening because they are, in a sense, fearing a scenario that is not likely to occur. They either underestimate the ability of their body to recover, or they, again, simply they nocebo themselves into thinking that they are experiencing CNS fatigue when in reality this could come from many other places. Because I haven't heard many people offer diagnosis or symptoms of CNS fatigue. Many people say, oh, you lose strength, but strength loss can come from many other factors. A caloric deficit, poor sleep, a bad day, bad environment, stress, all of that can also play a role. So it's a little bit iffy to always put the blame and the onus of responsibility on CNS fatigue when it could be many other things. And that relates to a meme and a certain level of fear-mongering I have found that is extremely prevalent in France and has started to seep into YouTube fitness as well in the US. And it's the frying of the CNS meme. It actually, for once, started in France, meaning that I remember French influencers like 6 or 5 years ago starting to spout that, saying, oh yes, you can actually fry the CNS. And in their mouth, this meant that you can overtrain to the point that your nervous system just is kaput and is incapable of sending impulses, and you lose strength and you can't train anymore. That is, of course, almost impossible. Again, look back at what we're able to do, look at physical labor. How exactly do you explain from an evolutionary standpoint that the body could just go in shock to the level that it's not able to actually fulfill proper function? I mean, it's surely doable, but you must give me and admit that the average person, the average gym bro, is never going to get that. You train 3 times a week, an hour each time. You truly think that's enough to fry your CNS? Understand also that saying that it's because of the load is not enough justification. Yes, we lift heavy loads, but the load that you lift, you are still capable of moving with your muscles. And therefore, this stipulates also that it doesn't have the ability to fry your CNS. Your CNS allows the muscles to move the load. This means that the muscles have the capacity to move the load. So why would it damage the CNS? As I said, the bucket of the CNS is much greater than the bucket of any muscles. But, and this is something that I'm going to cover later, the reason why it is possible to overtax the CNS is, again, because every time you train a muscle, you damage the CNS. We're going to get to that. I don't want to get lost in this storm of ideas and concepts. Now, to go back on the fear-mongering, I truly think that CNS fatigue tends to be a worst-case scenario, meaning that it's possible to get to that level, but you find in most cases that it's people who are just, again, living in fear of something that will never happen. And it's never good to present a worst-case scenario as the norm, because then you lead people to live and to engage in practices as if there were a worst-case scenario occurring. For example, again, imagine I told most people that there's going to be an apocalypse. Most people are going to start living as if an apocalypse was on the way. But there is no apocalypse coming. So what do they do now? Why? Well, they live like complete idiots because the way and the standards of living they engage in is not proper to their actual condition. That is the same thing we see with CNS fatigue. So, as I said, most people are going to just expect CNS fatigue to occur. They never experience it in the first place. So they detrain, they lose tonnage, they lose performance, but they tell themselves, oh, I did it so that I could prevent CNS fatigue. And that way, I'm going to be able to train again afterwards. So I, in a sense, escaped tragedy. We're going to continue with the metaphors. I feel motivated and inspired tonight. It's as if I told you, hey, if you don't cut the head off a chicken every single night and place it in front of your door, a big wolf is going to come and eat you. And you do it, and you wake up in the morning, and the big wolf never showed up. So you tell yourself, wow, NH was right. The chicken sacrifice shit actually worked. and then you cut a chicken's head every time you go to bed, and no big bad wolf comes, of course, because he doesn't exist. And so you continuously do that, and you pile up just a mountain of corpses of chicken in your living room because apparently it works. It's the same for CNS fatigue. You deload and you detrain, and you don't experience CNS fatigue, so you tell yourself, oh, it must work. Well, no, it's the same thing I just described. It's an apocalyptic scenario. It's an apocalyptic way of approaching training. It's not proper. And it kills your gains because you're leaving gains on the table. And I understand that, and I won't touch on it too much because it's the topic for the next video, but I understand that this might be misconstrued. I'm not saying that this leads people to not train as hard as they could every single time. I'm saying, however, that many people are. And I'm not engaging in a weird dick measuring contest because I understand that it's mostly what happens on YouTube Fitness. I'm not telling you that you don't train hard enough. It's not the point of the video. The point is to let you understand that you could be training more and you could be getting more out of your training if you didn't sabotage it every single time with that type, again, of fear-mongering. Because at the end of the day, what matters the most in lifting is balance. You don't want to burn yourself out and you don't want to undertrain because they both suck, right? Both are going to lead to subpar gains. The issue is that I see many more people who undertrain than people who overtrain and burn down themselves out. And it's because the worst case scenario always wins. This is the reason why CNS fatigue propaganda is so prevalent. When you tell people, hey, if you overtrain your CNS, you're going to not be able to lift for months at a time and you're going to have to be bedridden. Or if you tell them, hey, if you undertrain a bit, you might lose a tiny bit of muscle, but at least you will never get into the scenario of hospitalization. Which of these two are people going to take? They're going to prefer to undertrain on purpose so as to not, again, kill their gains for months at a time. The issue is that the scenario I just described about the bed in the hospital doesn't actually exist. It's a fabrication. And it's a fabrication that is also present when we discuss overtraining. I'm sure you have heard people tell you that if you overtrain, you're going to get rhabdo, which is a pretty serious condition. And the funny thing is that I don't know a single person who ever got rhabdo, and it's an incredibly rare condition to start with, meaning that I am personally someone who used to overtrain. I would train 4 or 5 hours a day. I would run for hours in the mountains, and I never got even an inkling of that, meaning that at worst, what overtraining does is you're just doing work for nothing. Like, it's the junk volume paradox. You're doing work that best case scenario does a minuscule amount for your gains. Worst case scenario damages your recovery, but most of the time it just does nothing. That's the reason why it's junk. It just does nothing. It's just neutral. So it's not that bad, but it's presented as something that could actually put you over the edge, make you overtrain, and then make it so that you're going to be bedridden. That is also the big bad wolf metaphor I described. It's fear-mongering. It's not going to happen. And the issue, and we're going to get into the meat of the topic here, is that it's true that if the scenario that these people describe about CNS fatigue was real, it would make training the muscles impossible because the muscles are in the bucket. So if the bucket of CNS is entirely empty, you cannot reach the buckets of the muscles. They're not usable. And again, keep in mind that it's not that they're empty themselves. It's just that you cannot trigger the nerve and the nerve impulse to actually get them to function, so you can't work them. It's a nuance, but it's a nuance that I think is worth mentioning. So it's a fear that would actually be justified, but it's not justified for one reason and one reason only. And that is because you quickly find out that there are certain lifts that, yes, are going to really tire the CNS, and therefore that should be, in a sense, approached with caution, but that's not every single lift. This blanket statement of CNS fatigue ignores the fact that there are certain muscles you can work that barely touch the CNS. And the best example of that is curls. Curls also are going to work the muscles, but they do almost nothing to your CNS. Or are you going to try to argue that doing 3 sets of curls has the potential to fry your CNS? That is nonsense, and I think it's fairly logical to make as an assessment. Understand that most lifts are like this. Most isolations and most movements you will make have very little impact on the CNS, so you can do them with no fear of actually damaging it. That is something to keep in mind. And it's a good thing to keep in mind because you also find out quickly that if you are the type of person that constantly undertrains their CNS, because the CNS is something that can be trained as well, what you're doing is not only are you damaging your ability to progress and to make gains now, but you're also making sure that you won't make gains in the future because you're not training the CNS. You could actually amplify your work capacity, get a stronger CNS, and get more work done in the future. And guess what? The CNS and the muscles are connected. This argument is used by people who preach CNS fatigue. I use it for the opposite. You're right, they're connected. This means what? It means that if you undertrain the CNS, at some point you're going to undertrain the muscles. Because if you tap into CNS every time you train the muscles, even if it's minimal, what happens if the CNS always runs out or if you always preemptively stop before it runs out because you're afraid? Well, guess what? The muscles are going to actually go through the same treatment because you cannot trigger the muscles without actually triggering the CNS. And this is when we get into those poor practices, those practices that lead to people who are going to have difficulty in progressing. They're going to have an issue with tonnage stability because they're going to get dips in tonnage every single time. And they're going to have an overall fear of work and of load. And again, yes, it's a straw man. I'm not saying that everyone who manages CNS is a CC and they don't know how to train. What I mean is that the people who listen to them tend to fall into that category because fear-mongering is very strong. A lot of lifters are riddled with a ton of completely unnecessary fears that at the end of the day are their actual demons. It's the actual problem. What you fear is not the problem, it's the fear itself. I'm not going to get philosophical, I promise, but that is sort of the gist of the issue with CNS fatigue. So a solution that I offer to you, now that we understand the problem and that we understand that it has been mistackled for the most part, is that yes, we have to take into account that some lifts are going to damage the CNS and actually drain it of its potential power expenditure. So how do we handle the problem? Well, it's very simple. You look at the lifts that actually do have that tendency and you program them accordingly. It's as simple as that. Look at the lifts that drain the CNS, look at the lifts that tend to be the most tonnage heavy, like for example, heavy compound movements, and then place them in the program where they belong and allow the CNS to recover in between. Understanding also that just because you're going to train other muscles as the CNS recovers from these lifts doesn't mean that the CNS suddenly stops recovering. Just because you're pouring water out of the bucket doesn't mean that you cannot fill up the bucket at the same time. That is an aspect of recovery that is widely misunderstood. And on top of that, also understand that, as I said, not all of the buckets in the big bucket of the CNS are going to need or require so much water to be poured out as they're being poured out themselves. So a good way to approach this is, for example, an upper-lower. Why do you think I espouse the upper-lower? It's because it's what makes the most sense for recovery and fatigue management. Upper tends to be days with less tonnage because the movements you can do with your upper body tend to be less demanding in terms of weight put on the bar. Also, they have less actual loading, they have less stress on the spine, on the hips, and the SI joint, which tend to be area that people who actually point out to CNS fatigue are actually referring to when it comes to that. So this is a good opportunity to get that work done. Then you follow with a lower day. The lower day has more of a CNS tax attached to it. But the great news is that what follows afterwards is another upper day. And that upper day is going to be less taxing. Now, as I said, you don't want, of course, to completely empty the bucket on the lower because then it has an impact on the upper. But if you don't, and you are actually conservative with your reps, and you get work done, you get quality reps in without killing yourself, you can come in and do your upper. It's something I've been doing for years. I have no issues progressing. And then you can throw in other little tricks or hacks, like for example, an arm day. Every single arm day should be renamed the no CNS fatigue day because a proper arm day will have a few compound movements for the upper body and then tons of isolation. That does nothing to your CNS. I would even go as far as to argue that it helps. It's active recovery and also allows you to get work done for the muscles that you tend to ignore because you find out quickly that the people who are going to always target and tolerate our programs towards managing CNS fatigue tend to ignore the small muscles. It's paradoxical, but it's because they think that every single muscle carries the same CNS cost. And that is the reason why they tend to ignore the small muscle. They tend to ignore isolation and over-focus on compounds, which paradoxically is the very reason why their CNS actually could get fatigued. It's an obsession that is simply not needed for bodybuilding. And I explained that already, but it is proven by the fact also that if you look at the relationship between muscles and CNS, it is almost impossible for the CNS to give up before the muscles because the capacity of the CNS is much greater. The only way you can do that is that every single time you actually train the muscle, you take out a large portion of the CNS with it. So of course, at some point, it's going to fail. I'm going to try and give you an image because I understand that it's not super clear. Let's say that the CNS is here, all right? You have that much volume, that's a lot of volume. And then you have a lot of small buckets that are like this. If every single time you empty one of the buckets that takes this much, it might very well be that you're going to empty 5 or 6 buckets, and once they're all empty themselves, the CNS is empty themselves. But you forgot all of the small buckets that wouldn't have taxed the CNS as much. This is minimalism. Minimalism is exactly that. It's the reason why CNS fatigue is so important for the type of people who engage in that is because every lift or movement they make comes at a great cost for the CNS. But that is simply not true for bodybuilders. For bodybuilders, you will find that most of the time you will be able to completely empty the bucket of recovery for muscles with a CNS that is still going to be fresh because smaller muscles have a much lesser work capacity than bigger muscles and prime movers. So they're easier to actually exhaust without destroying the CNS. And as they fill up to be exhausted again, the CNS fills up again. So it's a perfect way to program for muscle growth. And this is why the way I program is scheduled like this. And this is why I also want you to have this in mind if you program for aesthetics and bodybuilding. You want to space movements that have a heavy toll on the body and not over obsess on them. You can always find replacements for heavy compounds that copy movement patterns that come at a lesser cost to the CNS and get greater stimulus with less fatigue. Again, it's the bucket strategy I already described. You can use low reps sparingly. You don't have to always max out on 3 rep maxes. You can do reps in reserve. All of that also has an ability to tell your training towards hypertrophy and muscle fatigue instead of CNS fatigue. Something I forgot to mention because again, athletes, people who want to perform, do want to actually train the CNS so as to be maximally efficient. Bodybuilders train the CNS so as to be maximally endurant. It's not the same thing. Oh, well, we're getting into it again. Okay. Powerlifters are going to train their muscles. They're going to empty that bucket so as to reinforce the ability of the bigger bucket. Bodybuilders will do the exact opposite. Bodybuilders will develop the bigger bucket so as to be able to empty the smaller buckets. A topic I will cover again. I know it's very interesting, but if I start getting into it, the video is going to be an hour long. Now, to follow up with what I just said, you also want to be generous with isolation because they possess the capacity I just described of not taxing the CNS as much and recovering faster. And also, and that's what I'm going to end on, you want to let the training dictate the recovery. Powerlifters and strength athletes need to do the other way around. They need to let recovery dictate the training because they aim for performance. We aim for stability and endurance and muscular endurance to create hypertrophic responses. So you cannot fall for the same schemes or the same patterns of conceptualizations when it comes to training. You absolutely need to always have an eye out for your ability to empty buckets. And that dictates the way you're going to trade the big bucket and not the other way around. You cannot constantly look at that big bucket and think, okay, I'm going to plan my training around this because this is the best way to ignore the small buckets and to then end up with under hypertrophied muscles, aka atrophied muscles. Now, this is going to be it for this video. If you have comments or things you didn't understand, let me know because, as I said, next week I'm going to make a video on deloads that is going to, again, cover a lot of these topics that won't be about CNS per se, but more about recovery. So anything you can add, I can actually add to the video so that it's clearer for you guys, you can understand it. Program for bodybuilding, make the gains that you deserve. And I'm going to leave you with that. Thank you for watching. Have a good night.